Next up, we have a panel called Kubernetes Best Practices. The panel consists of Brendan Burns, distinguished engineer from Microsoft, myself, so I'll be changing hats here momentarily, Dave Strebel, cloud native architect from Microsoft, and Eddie Villalba, a principal software engineer for Microsoft, and it will be moderated by Bridget Kromhout, principal program manager for Microsoft, and this is all about Kubernetes best practices. So I will hand it over to Bridget. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lachie. Okay, so the book has been out for a while now. Let's meet our panel by means of them introducing themselves and giving the audience their one best piece of Kubernetes advice, or the one thing that they knew that they wish they knew when they got started with Kubernetes. All right, let's start with Lachie.
Thanks, Bridget. I think, when I go back to the start of the journey, it was trying to, when you come into Kubernetes and the cloud native ecosystem, trying to digest the whole thing in one mouthful is really hard. So we had this term incremental revolution. Don't use everything that Kubernetes has to offer immediately. Just solve the next problem and then iterate. So, come into it, serve the needs that your business has with something like Kubernetes, and then iterate on that. I would say that's my best advice. There were times I tried to take on way too much and change too many things at once. And I wish I just stuck to, the problem at hand and solving that. So I'd say if I was to leave you with 2 words, it would be incremental revolution.
Nice, I like it. Okay, Dave, what do you got for us?
Mine falls in line with Lachie's kind of. You need to walk before you run with Kubernetes. There's so much exciting stuff going on in the Kubernetes world. There's all these new technologies like service mesh and GitOps and so on. You go to KubeCon and you see all these technologies and you want to implement them day one. But what you should really do is focus on the core Kubernetes concepts, get really good at those, and then really think about what you want to layer on. Because everything you layer on adds complexity, adds operational overhead. So you need to be doing layering on stuff for really good reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Eddie, tell us about that.
Yeah, I think we all kind of have the same kind of thread. It's about, I think, simplify everywhere you can, especially when you're growing your cluster, growing your environment at scale. When you get large scale, it just gets more complex, and you want to simplify everywhere you can to make it easy for, as Dave mentioned, operational consistency across. So simplify, start from there, and then work your way to large, complex environments.
Scale is hard, who knew? And Brendan, what should people know right off the bat?
I think that the thing I agree with everything that was said so far, but the thing that I would add is set up the right foundation. Things like integration testing, the CI/CD flow, all of those things are really hard to retroactively fit in. So think about that flow, think about how you're going to manage things that way, because it's way easier to get that foundation right than it is to sort of try and, like jack up the home in the middle and put the foundation in underneath after you've already built the house. So think about that stuff.
Nice. Okay, so we've gotten the theme here. Kubernetes is full of complexity, but there's hope. Which are some of the complex topics we can demystify here, since we're talking to the authors of a book of best practices, starting with Dave?
Yeah, the one I find a lot of users struggle with, which seems very straightforward, but it's really not, is resource management. So setting requests and limits on containers. How does that impact like auto scaling, and how do you auto scale? Because you have things that are built into Kubernetes, but you can also extend things like auto scaling, and how does that have an impact? If you don't have good resource management in Kubernetes, you're going to have a bad day, because these all have impacts. And I think that resource management also falls into cluster design. So are you using one single big cluster versus multiple clusters out there? Anytime you run just a very one large cluster that's going to be multi-tenant. It's going to be that much more complex to manage resources, security, networking, all those type of things. So when you think of the resource management, also think about cluster design there, but really try to understand the concepts around resource management, around requests, limits, quality of service, first burstable, all those things you really need to understand to really have a healthy Kubernetes environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a lot of complexity there from the operational perspective, and I know also from the development perspective. Brendan, you want to kind of tell us what can we demystify about some of this complexity?
What can we demystify? I think that one of the, I'll go back to what I said earlier about setting up a pipeline. I think when we were thinking about that, there's actually a ton of automation out there that makes it a lot easier, and a lot of community stuff too, for that matter, that makes it a lot easier. So when you look at something like GitHub and GitHub Actions, there's a ton of pre-existing, actions out there that you can go through and actually, with a pretty simple YAML file checked into your repo, set up something that builds and pushes an image to a container registry. Set up something that runs a bunch of unit tests. Set up something that pushes, if those tests pass, pushes that out to a staging cluster in a Kubernetes cluster somewhere. So I think that sometimes it seems pretty daunting. It seems like, it's such a big task, and I think sometimes we don't do it because of that. But I think the truth is that at this point, there's so many good, automated cloud-based systems that we can use that you should look to do that. I think it's tricky because I think sometimes these systems come with a cost. Either it's a learning complexity or a actual monetary cost, or even a little bit of both. And I think people tend to sort of be like, oh no, I want to do my thing, or I want to roll my own, or I want to just use a virtual machine instead of using a service. I think we always underestimate the operational costs going forward. And so one of the things we can really do to demystify things is actually reuse other people's solutions as much as possible, because then we actually at some level get to blame them when it goes wrong, right? And so that makes our lives a lot easier. And it's easier to blame someone if you're paying them also, right? So that's something I would say. Take advantage of the things that are out there, even if it feels a little bit awkward at the beginning as you orient to that services perspective about how to do things instead of your, whatever maybe you have done before. So it's worth it. That like 3 hours or 4 hours of awkwardness is worth it.
Nice. All right. Yeah. What do you think, Lachlan?
Yeah, thanks. Let me just respond. I want to respond to what Dave and Brendan had said. So, Brendan saying don't reinvent. Essentially, there is tooling out there and jump on that tooling. Speaking from experience, we had written a tool in-house that did exactly the same thing as Helm back before Helm was a thing. And then once Helm was announced, we basically said, what can we do to get rid of this? Because contributing to that upstream thing is more valuable to everybody else, and we don't have to build all the code or maintain it ourselves. So, I see a lot of people starting with in-house solutions that they think are kind of bespoke to their use case, but don't always assume that that is the case. Typically, most people are solving a very similar myriad of problems in the cloud native ecosystem. And even though people's use cases might be slightly different for the tools, it's always worth going upstream and trying to leverage these open source communities, because they have that scaling factor that you get in terms of development and problem solving, and having a diverse set of minds actually tackle the problem. So I would just, on the reusability aspect, and don't reinvent the wheel, it's super important in this ecosystem where you tend to go into your own sort of problem solving. On the back of what Dave said, I always said this in the early days of Kubernetes was, if you don't tell Kubernetes what resources your pods require, they assume they require no resources, and will just schedule things until the node goes down. And that might seem like I'm talking from an ivory tower, but I know that from experience. If you don't put a resource request, it assumes you don't need any resources. And default behavior there is kind of a bit of a tripwire for most people. So, you know, Dave kind of casually says, be careful with your resources. I've actually been, had the cascading, the node failure happen to me and an unrecoverable cluster because I didn't actually set resource requests. And this brings
Or
me
limits,
to what,
right?
or limits, request
Limits, yeah.
limits. So the scheduler just doesn't have that information available, and it doesn't make it up either. It does exactly what you tell it to do. So resources are a big, you know, it catches a lot of people when they're first using Kubernetes. I think, you know, my point is going into policy, and Brendan brought up policy, and we have a policy talk from the OPA folks later today. But understanding what you want to be described in all of your Kubernetes resources and what you're allowing to be described, I think is now as sprawl is happening, you're not your first 10 resources on the Kubernetes cluster, now you're in thousands of resources. How do you start to say, these are the container repositories we use and trust? These are the resource limits you can have, because, you know, it comes part and parcel, as Brendan was saying, is more developers have access to this orchestrator. So you want to basically set it up in a way that allows them to do what they need, but do it safely. So I think policy is a big thing that we need to demystify in the open source community. And we do see even products coming out of that as well. So I think keep an eye on policy for Kubernetes, as that's going to be a big area where, as we go to multi-cluster, and making sure everything is in control and in a state that we desire. So that would be my demystifying piece. Go keep an eye on policy. I'll flick it to you, Eddie.
Yeah, no, I definitely echo all three of my peers' statements for sure. I have a different, not a different spin, but I look at it from different lenses, only because of the kind of work I do every day in kind of dealing with large global planetary scale customer and their Kubernetes cluster. And what I always find is that no matter what, when they start out and they have this great architecture for this, you know, starting out, and then as they start to progress to this large scale and huge, you know, large clusters across the globe, the first thing that breaks down is their network design and their idea of how that's going to work. And it really just comes down to simplicity. So it's really understanding the networking architecture of Kubernetes from the get-go, understand what it looks like across multiple clusters, across multiple regions, across different paths of ingress and egress. That will limit a lot of the headache and troubleshooting issues that you have with your workloads when you start expanding outside of a small dev test, dipping your toes in the water type scenario. And all that kind of lines up with what, you know, what Lachi's talking about and what Dave is talking about. It's, you know, understanding what is it that you want your clusters to be able to support and approve. What kind of, you know, what kind of resource constraints and what kind of load can I put into a stamp or a specific set of clusters, and then identifying what that looks like across my entire network, both hybrid, on-premise, completely in the cloud, or in lots of cases across different cloud providers. So that's networking. If you don't get it right, it becomes a headache really quickly. So that's where I come in.
Nice. And you're clearly speaking from a position of experience of having dealt with a lot of customers who are doing exactly these things that you're describing. So I'm kind of curious if you can give us your insight from those experiences of, I feel like there's so many times that we go into an established organization that's been doing things some way for a while, and you need to kind of move people towards good advice, but they aren't going to maybe change everything at once. How do you approach that in the Kubernetes context?
Sure.
Want to move people towards progress.
Yeah. Layers. I believe in, like, it's just take one layer at a time. You know, again, starting from that network layer all the way up into your application layer, and just really have good thought processes and good strategic planning around each of those layers and implement them, you know, one at a time, right? In the case, you know, in a Kubernetes native way, you know, identifying, you know, like I said, where's your major ingress and egress components from? How are your applications being deployed into your cluster? What is that process in terms of the, you know, rolling out new environments or rolling out new applications or failing over to exist to another cluster. All those things need to be thought of very methodically and taken into consideration as you're progressing, and take them in those small layers and those small chunks. When you try to, kind of boil the ocean very quickly, you miss things, and you're not. Then you have to kind of backtrack, and back to what Brendan said earlier. It's like once you're like even halfway down, it's kind of too late to start throwing new things in there. It's just now it's like you're just untangling spaghetti, right? And you're trying to figure out how to get everything going. So looking at those things in layers is probably my best suggestion there.
Nice, absolutely. And I feel like there is so much complexity and decision making there. And I know we chatted some months ago with the whole team about that. And Brendan focused on making sure you know why you're making decisions. I'm wondering, Brendan, if you want to expand on that in the context of this. Like, how do you make these decisions and get people to make the right decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this sort of goes back to what people said earlier about, not just sort of adopting tech for tech's sake. It's not just about going slow. It's actually sort of about knowing why, right? I think one of the things I've always said about the conversations I have with people when I go in to talk about Kubernetes or cloud native or any of these things is, like, what is your pain today, right? Because if you're really happy with where you're at and your business is achieving success, like you shouldn't change, right? Just because everybody's talking about cloud native and just because everybody wants their resume to be buzzword compliant, that may be an individual's perspective, and it may be a legitimate individual's perspective, right? I mean, but from a company's perspective, you should be adopting this tech because there's something you don't like, right? And for good or ill, most people I talk to, there is something that they don't like. But grounding everything that you're doing in that motivation and in a genuine, legitimate belief that what you're doing will help, right? You can't just sort of be like, oh, I'm going to, whitewash this thing that I want to do in the problem that my organization is facing so that I can do it,
Resume-driven development.
Right, resume-driven development is a real thing, right? Resume-driven development is for sure a real thing. But being honest and saying like, oh, okay, like agility is our main problem, right? Or reliability of rollouts is our main problem. Or, I mean, and sometimes it's even process, right? Like sometimes I've talked to teams where they've said, we really, really struggle to get our weekly release out. And you walk through and you say, okay, well, is it testing? And they're like, no, we're pretty okay with our testing. Is it automation? No, we're pretty okay with our automation. And then you find out that actually the real problem is that from a developer perspective, they kind of keep on doing just one more cherry pick, right? Like some developers like, could you just hold the release for like 3 hours? I'm going to be done. Like I'm going to get this PR in and we'll cherry pick it, right? And they don't have that sort of like the train leaves the station at this time. And if
I'm going to get this awesome PR in, it's totally tested, I promise.
Well, no, I mean, even when they have that stuff good, what you find sometimes is that people, it's just like, it's 3 hours and then another 3 hours and then another 3 hours, another 3 hours, and then you're going home and I'm not going to do a release at 4 p.m. And so I'm doing it the next morning. And like pretty soon it's Wednesday and you've been trying to be nice. You've been trying to be nice to the developers for 2 days and before you start your train. And so, talking about just sort of saying, no, you know what, this is our process. We acknowledge the fact, and it has to be on all sides too, right? Because one of the reasons developers want to do that is because the product or the business people are saying, when's my feature ready? When's my feature ready? And so if you don't all up do the culture in the right way so that, product understands, hey, yeah, we missed the train. And yeah, it sucks that we missed it by an hour instead of missing it by 4 days, but we missed it by an hour. We're going to wait. Just like, when you watch that train, I mean, we've all missed buses or trains. And like, as you watch it recede into the background, you're not happy, but like, I'm going to sit on the bench and I'm going to wait. And I think there's that aspect of things too, which goes sort of beyond process to culture and to setting things up in the right way so that, you do the right things. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And Lachie, I think that we've talked about this too. It's like that balance. How do you see this?
Yeah, I think that, it's a multifaceted kind of a system that you're trying to wrangle here. But from my experience, I always tried to work on creating a platform that solved the business's problems. And if any of the developers, because I come from kind of the infrastructure hat, were tied to the specific elements of that platform, I felt like I had failed, because I wanted to create a platform to deploy, the business's app, that each of the abstractions were interchangeable. If we needed another orchestrator, we could go get another orchestrator. If we needed another service mesh, we could go get another service mesh. And I know, that's kind of the goal state, and certainly we weren't all there, but, making sure that we built a platform that solved the business problems and actually had the business problems at the forefront of the platform that we built, whether it was deploying code at a faster rate, higher quality, packaging and distribution. There are so many problems that businesses are trying to solve with moving to microservices and cloud native tech stacks. But, keeping the business, I always had to check myself and kind of pinch myself. Was I doing this to actually solve a tech problem, or was I doing it to make my job, interesting? But, stay on target. I think keeping the business problems at the forefront is super interesting, and you need to kind of check yourself to make sure that that's how you're approaching the problem. Because as engineers, we should be trying to do that. We're building things for a purpose, not building things out of curiosity of building things. But I think, if I really, what I would like to get across here is, don't be scared to fail. I see, this rapid movement and people getting kind of stunned with the inability to make a decision because that decision might lead to failure. You will fail, and you need to be okay with that. And you need to learn from your failure and iterate quickly. So, in my time, you could get stuck in, what orchestrator, what service mesh? There's too many things, what logging stack? But at the end of the day, try one, see if it works for you. And if it doesn't work for you and your needs, replace it. I mean, most of these things are doing a very similar set of problems, just a slightly different way. But if you get stuck and you can't make a decision, it really slows down the whole process. So I think failing fast is something I had to learn to deal with, and that failure was part in crucial to success. And, you see that all the time in the business world too. Most people don't, hit oil the first time they go and build a business. It takes several times to fail with several different business models, and only some of them end up getting it right. But don't be scared to fail, and learn from your failure is probably the two things I felt were most valuable when trying to move the needle on how do we ingest Agile and DevOps and cloud native and all these things at the same time, which is a massive philosophical change from software development, even 5 years ago.
Nice. And tying back to what Brendan was saying, if you have that fast release cadence, then if something doesn't work, or if you do something just to a small amount of your audience, and then you see, we're not going to roll that out to everyone until we fix it.
Totally. And
a lot of these technologies enable those behaviors.
Absolutely. And one of our goals was, could we do a release per PR? Only because it was super easy to track down when a thing broke or when a regression happened, because we felt that the biggest quality issues were when you had a massive PR, because as Brendan said, everybody's trying to jam on the train when the train's already full, and somebody else is running up saying, hold the train, I got to jam in another 1,000 lines. And then, actually rolling that back and understanding what actually just broke. We were trying to have that golden state of, could we actually release software at such a pace that each PR, we could determine where the regression was, because we felt that was a more adequate way to do QA for our software too. So, back when I was running those kind of platforms. So don't hold back, if people are saying hold the train, just say, well, the next train's in 2 minutes, you know, a la what they do in Japan, not the next train is in 4 days. So then everybody's jamming thousands of things in.
Yeah. Yeah. And hey, you can always play the get blamed game. Okay, so Dave, what would you say if you're going to, you talk to customers all the time, you're giving people advice, what are you telling them to do?
The biggest thing I think is to move like Kubernetes forward in your organization is really bringing people along with you and educating them. A lot of times what I see is that the team managing Kubernetes is going to be different than the network team, the security team. We still have these silos within large organizations and organizations in general. When we don't bring them along, network and security are the two things I think you really have to get right day one. These are very hard things to retrofit in Kubernetes. They'll cause you a lot of pain. So it's something that you want to address up first. And I'll say my customer conversations, we spend a lot of time initially just on networking and security. Part of that is we have to have a different mindset with Kubernetes. This isn't like virtual machines where we expect them to be up 24/7. We're in a dynamic environment, so that changes network and security a lot. And the worst thing you can really do, I think, in Kubernetes is take all this old mindset and shove it into Kubernetes, because now you just got a platform nobody wants to use. You're not getting
Dave,
the total
the change control review board wants to look at your YAML.
Yes. So I think that's an important part, is really bringing the rest of the team along for that journey. Because a lot of times engineers want to leave out network and security, unfortunately, but they become very important up front with a successful production Kubernetes deployment.
Yeah, that's so very true. Okay, so I'm going to say you folks wrote the Kubernetes Best Practices book mid-2019. So I feel like you have lots of new ideas. Like, I'm curious if you can all wrap with what effects you've seen from the book in the last year, or maybe if you were doing a second edition, what topic would you expand on or add or totally and completely rewrite? I'll start with Lachie. Tell us what you think, Lachie.
Yeah, so, you know, when we wrote the book, we wrote it to be evergreen. So there are patterns and practices that aren't pinned to a specific Kubernetes version, as it were. But I would say I've seen a lot of people very concerned about Kubernetes upgrades and what this means for them. And, you know, in my experience and what I would like to say, and, you know, the goal here is, the end state is the goal of, you shouldn't care so much about the Kubernetes version as you do about the APIs that you're taking dependency on. So if they are enduring APIs, stable APIs, it doesn't matter what version of Kubernetes is serving those APIs. So you need to make sure that when you're taking a dependency on an API in Kubernetes, make sure you're taking dependency on a stable one. And if you're not taking it on a stable one, understand why. We see, you know, a lot of people getting caught up in, hey, I took a dep on this alpha API. Can you tell me when it's going to be in stable? And the answer might be, it's never going to stable. And the answer might be, we're going to deprecate it in 2 releases because nobody but you is using it. Or it could be, you know what, that wasn't, we need to redesign the whole thing.
It's almost like you were the release lead on a Kubernetes release that had some significant changes.
Yeah,
like.
I was responsible for making the call to deprecate all those old workload APIs in 1.16, which, you know, now is echoing throughout everybody moving up to those releases and beyond. But the idea is there that you're forming a relationship with an abstraction, and whoever delivers that abstraction should have the same kind of runtime implications that you can guarantee. So I think helping people make decisions about taking dependencies on APIs and being less concerned about specific versions of Kubernetes and upgrading them is something that I would like to talk about more, because I think that ends a lot of people in hot water, taking dependencies on strange APIs and never upgrading Kubernetes. So, you know, I think upgrade strategy of Kubernetes would be a very interesting topic to cover in a subsequent book. And, you know, there are snippets in there of blue-green, you know, blue-green cluster upgrades, whether building one large cluster, several small clusters. I think the strategy there could be thought through a little bit more in terms of helping the community understand, you know, if they are using a managed service or rolling their own or using on-prem, how do they make it so that they're not as worried about the Kubernetes version? Because I see a lot of contentious conversations around, hey, you know, why are we releasing every 3 months? And in one world, you know, maybe you build on it and never want to upgrade it. In the other world, you could say, well, it's just an API. Why not upgrade it? Why not build another one? Why not migrate? If you're really doing the cloud native thing here, how about moving your workloads that never want to reboot into a place where they might be able to be rebooted and horizontally scaled? So I think just, you know, as Kubernetes becomes more mature, there's less and less features in there that people need because most of the workload APIs and all the supporting APIs are there. And we're moving towards getting a lot of them into stable. You shouldn't need to move every 3 months to the latest, but you still want to make sure you don't get too far behind. So I think a chapter on that kind of planning aspect would be what I would want to do.
Yeah, especially because when you go to report bugs and people in the SIGs look at the version you're running and say, well, your first problem. Okay, Dave, same question for you. If you were writing more, what would you write, or what would you change, or what are you seeing this year since the book? And you are muted because computers.
Lachlan stole a little of my thunder there around day 2 operations with upgrades, because this is a huge problem I see. Even users that are using a managed cloud provider, Kubernetes service, you still have tons of clusters out there. How do I go through upgrades? The project's so fast moving. It seems like I'm entirely in this upgrade cycle all the time. So going deeper on that topic. Also, really how to debug Kubernetes. And I think that falls into also monitoring and logging. We kind of talked about like patterns and practices in the initial release, but we didn't go into a lot of detail on the tooling around that. A lot of users struggle with that kind of, if we want to call it observability, or we can call it monitoring, logging, either one. But they struggle around, how do I monitor all these different dependencies I have in my cluster? I've added on all these new tools. I got to monitor them. I got to monitor my applications. It's just an area of struggle that I think would be awesome to go deeper. So really that whole theme around day 2 operations. I think it's the biggest struggle right now around Kubernetes. My second thing I would love to do is have a chapter on how to get involved in the Kubernetes project and ecosystem, whether that, because I think that's an important part of the project. And a lot of people don't know how to get started with that. A lot don't even know how to kind of interact with a open source project. And it's something I've never seen in a book, but helping users kind of navigate that ecosystem. How can they get involved? Whether that's in, like, you know, shadowing the release team, things like that, or where to even go get help. There's a Kubernetes Slack channel that I find a lot of users don't know about, and you have thousands and thousands of users there at any moment to help you with the problem. A lot of times I use it myself. You can crowdsource a lot of stuff and see kind of what users are doing in that area. So I would love to see like a chapter on more of that navigation of the community.
Nice. Power of community. I love it. All right, Eddie, what's going in your second edition?
Yeah, I think mine kind of echoes a little bit of what both Dave and Lachlan were talking about, but it's especially, you know, a bigger section on large scale clusters. You know, large, when I say, you know, global planetary type scale environments, what it really takes to manage those and operate those. and I'm seeing that we're at a stage now where we're kind of over that kind of trough of uncertainty around Kubernetes, and we're starting to see all the enterprises are now just like, this is what we're going to be doing. This is the way we are moving to our platform, and this is what's going to be running our workloads. And what's missing is that little gap. Is like, okay, now we've tested it. We know our applications kind of work on the platform. We have a little bit of tooling and processes around it. Now I want to crank up the dial to number 11. Right. And it's like, whoa, that's not easy. and we talked about that. And I think a chapter on that, and part of that chapter talks about things like what Lachie is mentioning. You know, how do I treat clusters as ephemeral objects? That they go away. I don't care, right? What are those things that I need to build on and process? You know, is it GitOps? Is GitOps the right answer to be able to say, hey, this cluster's gone. I don't care. Bring it up. A new one. Everything's running right away. How do I manage the observability across this large environment? How do I manage policy across all of these clusters? And when I say clusters, those clusters can be in multiple cloud providers, on-premise, sitting in a closet at a store somewhere, or running in the back of a truck, you know, in a war zone, right? That's the reality of where we're seeing Kubernetes today. It's everywhere. And a bigger chapter, or a chapter where it kind of susses out those specifics would be probably my big point.
Awesome. This Kate's goes to 11. All right, Brendan, want to bring us home?
Sure. I mean, I think about a couple different things. One is a little bit, it has been echoed a little bit, but one, I think the biggest questions that I see people struggling with is it my fault, effectively, right? Like, my application, like, there's this ton of complexity here, but there's also a ton of complexity hidden. And so somebody will come in and say, oh, okay, I had this application, it was running on virtual machines with a database server and a front-end server. I ported it to Kubernetes, I did that whole thing. Operationally, it looks okay, you know, like, it works. Then I turned up the scale knob to 11, as Eddie said, and like, it broke, right? Something's not working, right? And sometimes it's because, you know, doing that has illustrated a problem in the app, right? Like, there's a bottleneck that people didn't know about. Or they're going to Kubernetes in response to something like COVID-19, where their load just spiked, and it's like, oh, is it Kubernetes, or is it just that your traffic doubled, you know? And I think we do a lot of work to help people through that, help people understand whether it's, you know, and sometimes it is a bug in the system or something like that. Help them understand where the bottleneck is coming from. Even something as simple as like, oh, you need to scale, and this is sort of to Eddie's point, but like, kube DNS in a large scale cluster, a lot of activity, DNS can get hit. DNS shows up effectively as connections timing out. Mm-hmm. And very few people draw the pointer all the way from like, my connection to my database is timing out, down to, oh, hey, kube DNS is overloaded, and so none of my DNS requests are succeeding, right? Like, it requires a lot of knowledge of how the whole sausage was put together in order to understand that flow. And so I think that we could do more to basically help people figure out where to look for the problems. I'd also probably like to put in a section on a lot of the work we've done on policy and the evolution of policy and kind of landing zones for clusters, right? Because I think that it kind of dovetails with all the CI/CD we talked about earlier, but that idea that the cluster itself is kind of like a controlled environment and a place that you want to normalize is I think something that is really powerful and is, again, part of that progression from Kubernetes being a developer-centric thing to being like IT admin, you know, CISO kind of centric thing, where how do you help that network security person feel comfortable in this new environment? So those are some things I think we could add on.
I love it. So I think to sum up, we've got CI/CD and security and policy, and the reality that even in Kubernetes, it's always DNS. Right. Thank you so much to our panel. We will hand it back over to Lachie. Lachie, you want to take off your panelist hat and put on your mod hat?
Thanks, folks. Bye.